The Titanic was built on the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. At the time, the ship was the biggest afloat. In the early 1900s, the transatlantic passenger trade was highly profitable and competitive. The race was on to create ships that could transport wealthy passengers and immigrants. Owned by the White Star Line, the Titanic was a new look in ocean travel with squash courts and a swimming pool. The first-class grand staircase was over 60 feet from the lower landing to the glass skyland above. The ship was the first of its kind, so current regulations, or lack thereof, was insufficient for the ship. The Titanic was in new waters.
The Board of Trade had no safety regulations in place for a ship that size. The 1894 Merchant Shipping Act required the number of lifeboats to be in direct proportion of the tonnage of the ship, but the regulations stopped calculating at 10,000 tons, which required 16 lifeboats, and the Titanic was 35,000 tons. The Titanic was so large the builders called it virtually unsinkable. The Titanic set sail April 10, 1912. Thomas Andrews, who was the ship's builder, was the first to board, along with 9 other Harland & Wolff employees. Each class boarded the ship through a different entrance. First class was escorted to their staterooms, while third class was greeted by a medical officer for examination. Once all the passengers were on the ship and settled in, Captain Edward J. Smith prepared to set sail. The Titanic made 2 stops before making its third and final stop at the bottom of the ocean. The first was in Cherbourg, France, and the second in Queenstown, Ireland.
As the passengers were enjoying their time on the unsinkable ship, the Titanic started receiving messages through the wireless operators about ice on April 12th. 2 warnings at 9 a.m. and 11:40 a.m. arrived on Sunday, April 14th, reporting icebergs and growlers. 2 more warnings came in right after lunch. Captain Smith took the message down to lunch with him and showed it to J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. Ismay did not seem worried at all. The bridge officers thought that they could avoid the ice by altering the ship's course, but Captain Smith made the decision to go forward as planned. At 7:30 p.m., Harold Bride delivered a warning message to the bridge reporting 3 large icebergs from another ship, the Californian. This message was not passed on to Captain Smith, and the ice was now 50 miles away from the Titanic. The iceberg was officially seen at 11:39 p.m., and the ship hit 37 seconds later. Not 10 minutes after the Titanic hit the iceberg, the first 5 compartments of the hull were filling with water. The water pressure on the weakened joints made the rivets pop out.
The first distress signal was sent at 12:10 a.m., but help was 58 miles away. When the last lifeboat was loaded, there were over 1,500 people left on the RMS Titanic. Some of them stood quietly on the upper decks. Some people jumped overboard. Others found a quiet place to sit and wait, and some prayed. The Titanic began to break apart in 2 pieces, a part between the 3rd and 4th funnels due to the stress on the steel hull. Many lifeboats, not full to capacity, did not return to save more people because they were afraid that the ship would go down fast and cause a whirlpool effect that would sink their boats. The stern did just the opposite as it bobbed in the water for a minute or so and began to sink, slowly into the water.
The public reaction to the disaster was shock and disbelief. In the 40-year history of the transatlantic crossing, only 4 lives had been lost. The Titanic took 1,500 down with her in one night.
America. Well, it was really pretty amazing. The world was shocked. I guess the best comparison I could give you as to what's going on in the world today with a missing airliner with 220 people on board, 229 passengers on board, a giant airliner, it's gone, it's missing for more than a week. How could that have happened? The world's captivated by it. It was the same thing in 1912 when the Titanic went down. This was a supposedly unsinkable ship, and the stories of survivors as they eventually came back, the world was wrapped up in the story of the Titanic.
People woke up on the morning of April 16th to conflicting reports regarding the event and loss of life. Before the Carpathia, loaded with the Titanic survivors, had even docked in New York, Senator William Smith of Michigan had already proposed a resolution to President William Taft and was contacting witnesses. 82 people would eventually testify. The British Board of Trade also launched an investigation, recognizing that existing regulations were outdated. Both committees completed their investigations within 2 months and adopted new regulations. The U.S. adopted Senate Bill 6976 on May 23rd, which changed marine laws.
Number 1. The number of lifeboats and life jackets would have to accommodate every person on board. Lifeboats would no longer be calculated by the ship's tonnage, but by one per passenger. These new laws struck down the life-saving appliance rules of 1902. Number 2. Crew must be trained for the ship on which they serve. In 1912, a coal strike was occurring, and crew members recruited to man the Titanic were not trained for that ship, were not familiar with the ship or each other, and were especially unfamiliar with the lifeboats and their deployment. After the Titanic, crew members were required to lower and drill in the lifeboats twice a month. Number 3. In 1913, the Conference on Safety of Life at Sea formed the IIP, the International Ice Patrol, to ensure safety in shipping lanes regarding icebergs. In 1914, the U.S. Coast Guard assumed this responsibility, and since then, no ships have been lost due to collision with ice. Number 4. Changes to the operation and regulation of wireless telegraphy on ships. Prior to the Titanic, there were 2 different Morse code languages, and operators were not regulated. The sinking of the Titanic directly impacted the radioactive 1912, resulting in the following requirements. An operator must be on duty at all times. Communication between bridge and wireless operators must remain open at all times, and operators must be licensed.
Number 5. Changes were also made to shipbuilding regulations, which extended the watertight line on all ships and required transverse bulkheads to be watertight to ensure stability. Number 6. Finally, the U.S. would no longer accept inspection certificates of foreign ships unless they met all the same regulations required by the U.S. These changes represented the renewed responsibility of the world toward ocean safety. The ships themselves became safer, emergency procedures were defined, and shipping lanes were no longer under threat due to ice. But what about the passengers that night on the Titanic? All who boarded assumed that life-saving procedures were in place on the unsinkable ship. In reality, the lifeboats on board could only hold 1/3 of the total passengers, and many left the ship not nearly full to capacity.
It was almost like murder, wasn't it? They had no lifeboats to look after them. Board of Trade were equally to blame for allowing a ship of that description to leave port with 16 lifeboats.
Of those that were lucky enough to make it into a lifeboat, the survivors reflect class distinction.
But the statistics are uncomfortable. 62% of the first-class passengers survived, compared with 25% of the third class. Not a single third-class survivor testified at the hearings. Third-class survivors told of locked and guarded gates, prohibiting them from reaching the upper decks and the lifeboats.
The rights of the lower class were grossly violated. The Titanic, a mighty titan of the sea, sank and dragged 1,500 people down with her to their deaths because of the lack of responsibility by the shipping line.
Major reforms occurred after the Titanic disaster, and ocean travel changed forever.